Well, welcome all to this session with Culture Collective artists and people from various projects and organisations. I'm Katharine. I work for the Stove Network, and I'm going to chair the session today with Martin. Martin, do you want to say hello?
Hello, I'm Martin.
So Martin and I are sort of two of the main people leading our Culture Collective project for the Stove, but we've also got Matt here, who's our orchestrator for the Stove Network. And we've got Simon Sharkey, who's here as an associate Stovey. He's going to run a session in a few weeks. And we've got a lot of our what we do now, which is the Culture Collective project for the Stove artists. And then we were really delighted to be able to open this out to the wider Culture Collective network. And we've got Katharine here as well, which is great. And we've also got some other Stovey team members. So we've got Katie Anderson here. I'm just introducing a few people. So unfortunately, we can't go around and introduce everybody, but we're going to go into breakout sessions as we go through the session. But please do use the chat as much as possible to say hello, as well as be as interactive as we can through the session. So, of course, the other person to introduce is François Matarasso, who's here today to run a session for us. Thank you for coming, François, and is also part of the team, the Culture Collective team that Katharine Welch has put together. What's your role again in the wider Culture Collective, François?
I think I called it caretaker. The person that goes behind and sweeps up.
I quite like that. I like the caretaker term. So I'm just gonna read out a little bit from the information that François gave us. So François has been a community artist for 40 years in the UK, including several parts of Scotland and internationally. And he's also an independent researcher, writer, and consultant. And we sent a link to his book, his latest book, A Restless Art, How Participation Won and Why It Matters, which was published in 2019. And you can download a free PDF, actually, or if you're like me and love to have real paper copies of books that I don't read as much of as I should, then you can also buy it. And today the session is going to be very much about how and why artists work in communities. We sent out some prompts, which you may or may not have had time to think about. And it's going to be a combination of François doing a bit of talking and presentation, but also hopefully some really interesting discussion, and we can be as interactive as possible. So on that, I'm gonna hand straight over to you, François.
Okay, thanks very much, Katharine. It's lovely to see you all. And I must say, I wish I was in Scotland. Well, I'm talking to you from France, which is very nice, but it's always lovely to be in Scotland, even by proxy. Katharine and Martin and I talked about this in some detail a few days ago, and I think I hope that it can be a conversation, because otherwise it's going to be a very long time of you listening to me. So what I've tried to do is to split it into three bits, where I'll talk a bit, and then at the end of each bit, I've got a question, which may not be the question you want to answer or talk about, but at least it's something to get things started. And it partly what I've done is talk about things that reflect the conversation that we had. So to make it a bit more interesting, I've got some pictures, so I'm going to share my screen now, which I hope will now work. Yes, okay. So an overview of what we'll do. Begin. Okay, I want to talk a bit about histories, because I think the histories are not known even by people who've been there for a long time. They're not as well known as they could be, and I think they're important because they inform how I think about what I do, but they also inform it in a more human way as well. Then I want to talk about intentions, and then finally, the third bit is the woolliest, because actually it's changed as I've prepared this. So it's kind of called strategies, but I'm I'm really going to talk about two things in that final bit, which are maybe strategies, but at quite a high level. But anyway, we'll see when we get there. Okay, first thing, I want to share this with you as a kind of underlying idea. This is from a Pakistani economist called Mahbub Haq, who worked for the UNDP and did the first Human Development Report in 1990. And this is from that first report that he wrote. The real wealth of a nation is its people, and the purpose of development is to create an enabling environment for people to enjoy long, healthy, and creative lives. I think it's interesting that he spoke about creative lives as an economist. And that idea, the image, by the way, is from this fantastic music festival in Setúbal on the coast of Portugal, which started a couple of years after the financial crash in 2008, when the city was all but bankrupt. And the festival, which I've written about in the book, is an object lesson in how to make something really creative and powerful when you don't have any resources except people, which is why it seemed nice to put it behind this quote. This quote is an idea that I will come back to at the end, but it kind of underpins everything I'm going to talk about. What the purpose of this is. The purpose of my work, you can argue about how effectively I've been able to achieve it, but its intention, its purpose, is to contribute to creating an enabling environment for people to enjoy long, healthy, and creative lives. Okay, now, first section. This, by the way, is a still from a project I was working on up until, and it reached the end of its first phase just before the pandemic struck. It was with the Lawnmowers, who are a theatre group, independent theatre group of actors with learning difficulties, based in Gateshead, and it started off as a play, but it became a film, and that's one of the openings. As part of the opening, it's a still from the opening of the film. So, as it says, a very brief history of artists working with communities, and I want to go right back. This is the Mechanics Institute in Coldstream. I don't think it exists anymore, but it's a really important, this and many others like it are really important for me as representing the roots of what this work is about. The people have been doing this work for so long, really since what we think of as modern societies, industrial cities, and working people in industrial cities. Since those two things came about, working people have wanted to create their own resources for their own cultural and creative development. And here is a little extract from the origins of the School of Arts in Edinburgh, what is now Heriot-Watt University. It started as a mechanics institute. And I won't bother reading out all of that, but it started on, I think it's important to say, some mechanics institutes, and the School of Arts in Edinburgh was one, started as middle-class initiatives, the resources of well-meaning people. And I don't underplay that, because I'm a well-meaning middle-class person doing what I do, and I've spent my life doing what I do. But it is not the only thing. Lots of other mechanics institutes grew from grassroots initiatives. And the bit that I liked in this was just the bit when Dr. Brewster created a plan for what he thought might be possible, and it was circulated among some of the most considerable master mechanics with the request they would read it in their workshops and take down the names of their workmen as expressed a desire to obtain instruction of the kind proposed. And this is 1820, right? This is the very beginning of the industrial era, when people are going out to talk to other people and say, do you want to be part of something? That's what I liked about this particular quote. And of course, where it leads to is all of the things that the School of Arts in Edinburgh has become. And this is by no means exceptional. There was an art school set up as a mechanics institution in Sydney, in Australia, when it was still a penal colony. The great large parts of the roots of our cultural institutions belong here, and that's not sufficiently known or acknowledged. So that's the long roots, the deep roots. But I also wanted to talk briefly about the roots of, if you like, of living memory. And I think there are three generations of community arts practice, and this is all a bit neat and tidy. Particularly the dates, so you don't need to worry too much about the dates. But I think there are 20-year spaces when the context has changed and the people doing it have changed, and therefore the reasons why they do it and how they have done it have changed. And the first generation that I would describe as a pioneer generation were the people who became community artists from the mid-60s until the late 80s, roughly. And they had the great advantage of working in an open field, because nobody had done community art before, at least not in the way that they were doing it. And consequently, there wasn't any precedent. There wasn't any sense of this is how you do it. This is the correct way of doing it. You then get a second generation, which I think of as consolidators, and the name changes from community art to participatory art, and the Arts Council loses interest in the work. Well, it didn't have much interest in the first generation, but it specifically shoves community art out to first regional arts associations and then arts boards, and then they got submerged into the Arts Council of England in England. I know the context in Scotland is different, but it also shoves it out to local government, and the work becomes, well, it changes character. Now we can talk about that if you want to a bit further on. And then you have this period where there isn't a name for it. As you can see, there is a profusion of names that emerges in the last 20 years for this practice. And there is a generation that is more empowered, but it becomes complicated as that long list of names becomes complicated by the work is now happening in all over the world, and consequently the contexts are very different. The needs that it's responding to are very different. The histories are very different. So, for example, the example I showed you before from Portugal, in places like Portugal, Italy, Greece, Spain, Eastern Europe, this is still quite a recent world. So it's much more back to the open world of the first generation, where there are not precedents. But of course, the situation is fundamentally different in all kinds of ways. The reason why those generations happen are complicated, but I'll say one thing, which is that community art has often been a young person's practice, because it's always been really hard to earn a living doing this, which means that it tends to people tend to get pushed out of it, or to move out of it once they, in their own lives, have more dependence, more obligations, more demands, and are not able to expend so much of their own human capital in making it possible. Now, that's a generalization, and we can talk about that. Now, okay, I want to, sorry, this is slow, because I was talking about placemaking with Katharine and Martin, and that's part of some of what the Stove is interested in, and some of others of you in the network are interested in. It just got me thinking to the ways in which placemaking was imagined during those three generations, and these are just some very sketchy examples. They don't represent everything that was happening in any of those generations, but they'll give you a sense of what they're about. The image on the right is a mural by Greenwich Mural Workshop in Charlton in southeast London. Greenwich Mural Workshop was founded by Steve Lobb and Carol Kenner, who had been involved in the occupation of Hornsey Art College in 1968, and were part of that first generation of artists who were really committed to taking art practice out of the gallery and into communities. This particular mural is, I think, really important because it encapsulates a lot of what that first generation was about. The plan was the local authority, which was Greenwich, London Borough of Greenwich, was planning to demolish these streets and redevelop them. And Carol Kenner and Steve Lobb worked with the community to create a mural that showed the community resisting the demolition of their houses and refurbishing them. And it's symbolically important because the mural was part of a campaign that was successful and led to the conservation of the houses that are still there, and the mural is still there indeed, 40 years on, more than that, nearly 50 years on. And I know about that because I trained with Greenwich Mural Workshop. I trained with Stephen and Carol in 1981 as an apprentice community arts worker and printmaker. And what what you can see in the other image is a younger me and a couple of friends with whom I worked on a mural in Newark-on-Trent, which is when I was then working. But the point about that, and the reason for including it, is because that's the last piece of mural work I was involved in, and it really taught me the limits of doing that kind of work. It was too difficult and too long, and it even things like getting people up scaffolding was difficult. A lot of people didn't want to go up scaffolding, perfectly understandable. we didn't do things like risk assessments in those days, but nowadays the complications would be very different. So that was really about me both discovering the potential of that work in graduate workshop, but also the limitations of it. Next generation of placemaking. We're in a post-industrial era, and this is an example, very nice example, Sunderland Riverside Sculpture Trail, developed by Colin Wyborn, Chaz Brenchley and others, over a long period of time on the former site of Sunderland's steelworks and shipyards that are now part of a university, and a series of sculptural works which were very much about placemaking and drawing on the history of place. So this is where this is an area where some of the important Anglo-Saxon culture from the 7th and 8th century has left its traces, and that's what you can see, for instance, in the illustration and in one of the photographs there, which is inspired by the Lindisfarne Gospels. But this was very much a kind of placemaking that was amelioration, recovery. It was trying to help places that were scarred by massive transformation of their industrial heritage, and trying to find ways of reconstructing them. And finally, an example from now. This is the Portland Inn project by Anna Francis, Rebecca Davis and others. Anna Francis is an artist. It's in Stoke-on-Trent. Anna Francis lives in Stoke-on-Trent. In fact, she lives in the street on the left-hand side of the image. I think, sorry, it might be the other way. Anyway, she lives and works in this area, and she's been developing work with her neighbours as part of her sense of place. The project there has grown and become more and more ambitious. The Portland Inn was the derelict pub in the centre of what is one of the most rundown neighbourhoods of Stoke-on-Trent, and they have managed to get an agreement with the local authority, and the pub has become a community asset, and the plan is that it will be transformed into a site for, it's already being used as a site for artists for arts activities with local people, and it will also become a place where there will be a place for artist residencies and so on. So very different ideas and cultures that say something about the last 50, 60 years of artists working with people and places. So the next bit I want to talk to you about is the reasons why we do this. So this is about intentions. Let me share my screen again. Okay. So why do artists work with communities? This image is taken from a project, a community opera done by Opera North with people in the Pennines of County Durham. And obviously it raises all of those questions about why does an opera company want to make a community opera with these very different communities, because there were former mining communities and hillside farming communities. So this is fairly standard stuff I'm going to give you now, but I'm hoping I can give you a way to think about it that might be useful. I think there are three broad intentions, three broad intentions that come out of analyses of the relationship between art and society. The dominant one remains cultural democratization, which has been the basis of European or cultural policy in Europe since the end of the Second World War, and in many other places as well. And all the three intentions I'm going to talk about, they have older roots. They have ancient roots because of the history that I was talking to you about, but I'm not going to talk about the history for now. So I'm only going to talk about the post-war period. In the post-war period, you see the beginning of the welfare state and the beginning of public funding of the arts. So the creation of the Arts Council in the UK, the creation of Ministry of Culture in France, and similar initiatives elsewhere. And that conception of public culture, public art, is essentially paternalistic. It is saying we must give access to the best that is possible to the most people. In the same way that people should have access to healthcare, they should have access to education, they should have access to work, they should have access to arts and culture. And this image is one of the most powerful examples of that theory. It's an image from El Sistema, the music education program from Venezuela, which has since spread to many other parts of the world and been imitated, and is about teaching the kids from poor communities, disadvantaged communities, about classical music and how to play and perform classical music. That has been described in European terms as the democratization of culture. The second, and it's not the area we'll talk about most, the second big area of intention is when there is an intention to bring about social change. This is an image and a quote from Geese Theatre, who work in prisons in the UK. And this is their mission statement when they say they're about using theatre and drama to enable choice, personal responsibility, and change among individuals who've offended. So the logic says that if they found that football was more effective in order to do that, they would turn themselves into a football organisation instead of a theatre organisation. And that, I mean, it's a very honourable and intention, and it has many antecedents. It is about a commitment to social change and recognising the power and value of art and culture in doing that. And it's an approach which is used widely, not least in development. The third, the third intention is often called cultural democracy. And there are debates about what that means, and there are debates about where it originated. I think it originates in its modern term, although it was being used in America in the 1940s as a term. In Europe, it emerged as part of the challenge of the 1960s. The 1960s were partly a challenge to that very paternalism of cultural democratization. It was a challenge to the idea that of the welfare state as being something that provided for people, but provided in a paternalistic way what the people in charge thought was good for people. And you see that happening in initiatives in France, and crucially in a big conference of the Council of Europe in 1976, I think, in Oslo. They brought together most of the ministers of culture of European countries outside the Soviet bloc at the time. It's really interesting to look back at that, because they start saying we have to recognize that our cultural policy has been rejected. It cannot simply be about giving people what we think is the best and that they should have. We have to start recognizing that culture is diverse, that people already have culture, that there are many forms of culture, and we have to start recognizing and supporting the cultures that already exist and that people want to do. Then cultural democracy is then taken on by, not least by the community arts movement, and made into a still more interesting and challenging idea. And this is part of what those ideas were. So the Campaign for Cultural Democracy, which didn't, as far as I know, didn't ever produce a final charter. It only ever reached the stage of being a draft charter. But I'll just let you read that as an example of a vision that says, the heart of it is the idea, I think, that people have the right to put across their own point of view in their own particular way. It's about empowering people to make art and culture that is meaningful to them. And that remains a central dilemma and challenge of our cultural life. Now, I'm going to give you a way. This is how I conceptualize these things. So that there's a field of work of cultural democratization, a field of work of social change, and a field of work of cultural democracy, and they overlap. These are not mutually exclusive, and they don't have rigid lines. They shade into each other, and within them, across them, it is possible to do participatory art with all three of these intentions. It is also possible to do all three of these things and not be doing participatory art, which is why my yellow circle doesn't cover all of the other circles. Crucially, it's a territory of shifting intentions, and this is how I want to talk about the participatory art part of it. And in the book that was mentioned at the beginning, because I was trying to get to grips with a lot of this history and a lot of the concepts, I did think that I needed to offer some definitions. And my definition of participatory art is that you can see on the screen at the moment, and it's deliberately meant to be as open as possible in order to include everything that happens within this field. My own work is community art, which is different and is more challenging than participatory art. But it is possible to have to do participatory art with all three of those intentions. And these little dots are intended to represent the ways in which people may occupy different positions that reflect their understandings of power in participatory art and their relationship to each of those objectives. So it's not like if you're committed to cultural democracy, you're not doing cultural democratization or you're not doing social change. It's possible to do all three of these things simultaneously to different degrees. And it's to do with where you think you stand. Do you stand nearer or further away from one or other of those intentions? And crucially, two things need to be understood, I think. One is that individual projects may have people or stakeholders who stand in different relations to those three intentions, but still work. In other words, within the stove, there's a lot of people involved in it. Within the new project of what we do now, you're bringing in 10 artists, and it's very unlikely those 10 artists all see these intentions in the same way and all position themselves in the same place. But it's perfectly possible for people to stand within an overarching concept, but closer or further away from each of those intentions. The second way in which, the second level of complexity is that people's positions change. They change as a result of being involved in a project. They change because they learn, because they think as the beginning of a project, they think, oh, well, I was trying to enable people to have access to art in a logic that would fit within cultural democratization. But as I've been working with them and as I've listened to other people, I now see I'm more interested in social change, or actually cultural democracy is more where I think I want to go. So none of this is stable, which is why I talk about a border territory of shifting intentions. But it's precisely the fact that it's shifting and unstable, why I call it a restless art, that makes it so interesting and so dynamic and so challenging to work with. Okay, so this kind of, as I said at the beginning, this is the bit where I kind of got a bit lost, but I'll tell you, I'll give you some stuff or some ideas that I hope might be useful. One of the things I've been thinking about recently is co-creation as a term, which it's not a word that I had used before, but it is part of the vocabulary of the opera project that I'm involved in. And so I've had to do a lot of thinking about it. And as part of that, it seemed to me that it was important to think about given what I've said about participatory art being the creation of work of art by professional and non-professional artists. And for me, that's an important distinction, because I think that the only way of being an artist is to make art. You're not an artist because you went to art college, or because you didn't. You're an artist because you make art, in the same way that you're a runner because you run, or you're a cook because you cook. It's independent of a judgment of quality. You may be a bad artist, but you're being an artist. But there is a difference between professional artists, people who have a framework of training and practice and knowledge and reference points, and non-professional artists who have different resources that sometimes can be as valuable, but are not the same as those that a professional artist brings. And in co-creation, I think there is a spectrum of where the power lies about that degree of control, who's in charge, who gets to say. It's just another way of thinking about where you stand. How much control are you willing to give to the people that you're working with? And then this is another way of thinking about that, which is goes back to the question that Andy was asking at the beginning, just before the break. And this is a question I've found myself asking myself. Whose story is this project a chapter of? This was a piece by the American artist Theaster Gates called Sanctum, which was installed in a bombed out Bristol church in 2015, and for 24 hours a day for about a month, I think, Theaster Gates invited local people to talk or sing or perform or tell something about themselves. This is from the art newspaper, and I thought it was kind of interesting because it says Theaster Gates brings new life to bombed out Bristol church, as if somehow this was a place with no life, as if it needed these gates to frame literally these people and their activities in order to give them legitimacy and recognition by the art world. And there's a considerable amount of contemporary art that uses participation strategies of this kind. And so for me, in this case, it's very clear that this is a chapter of Theaster Gates's story, and it will be written up as a project among many other as part of his oeuvre. I don't know how much it's a chapter of the story of Bristol or the people who took part in it. And then I contrasted that with this. This is the most recent project that I've worked on, which was, it's called Wish You Were Here. And it was a creative writing project that happened online, where I was facilitating creative writing sessions with people living near or in Boston, in Lincolnshire. And it was originally supposed to happen last year. Of course, with everything, it didn't. And then it happened online. So there were 10 workshops on Zoom. And in fact, what's been really interesting, which is why this is the person you can see in the image, is Sonia Hundal, who's a writer that I was working with on the project. And she had just received the box of books, and she put a video onto Twitter so that people could see it. The box had just been delivered, and at that point I hadn't seen a copy of the book yet. And the whole production, the whole project happened online, and we still have never met in real life. I'm hoping we may do that in September, when there's going to be a book festival. But the point is, this was, so the project and the book was called, it was titled Writing from Boston's Lockdown, and it's got the names of the writers involved in it on the front of the book, as you can see, and Rosie Redzia, who did the drawings. It doesn't have my name on it at all, except on the title page it says that it was edited by me. And my point is that this is, I hope and intend, it's a chapter of Boston's story, and that it's not absurd to think that in decades to come, when people want to know what lockdown was like, what the COVID pandemic was like, in the way that now people ask what the flu epidemic was like, they might go to the library and get out a copy of this book and remember and get that sense. So my intention is that this is a chapter of the story of Boston, not a chapter of my story or any of the artists involved in it. Now, the last bit I want to talk to you about brings us back to the starting point, that quote by Muqbal al-Haq. And sorry, this is last year. I worked with on something called the Rome Charter, which was me. If in my head, I was the main writer of it, and in my head, what I was trying to do was to answer a question that I've had in the back of my mind for a long time. Article 27 of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights says that everyone has the right freely to participate in the cultural life of the community, to enjoy the arts, and to share in scientific advancement and its benefits, all of which is fine as far as it goes. But what does that actually mean? I think that if if you asked governments of most countries, they would say, yes, well, people have the right to participate in the cultural life of the community. We, the Chinese government, guarantee that to everybody. So do we in Russia, so do we in America. But clearly, people's actual rights are very different in practice. So I've been trying to think that through for a long time. And in the Rome Charter, I made a connection with the thinking of Martha Nussbaum, who's an American philosopher, and she has worked on something that is called the capabilities approach, and has been widely used in international development. And in fact, Muqbah al-Haq was one of the people whose thinking led to that. The person who's most widely associated with is the Indian economist and philosopher Amartya Sen. In her book, Creating Capabilities, Martha Nussbaum writes this. So she says that capabilities are the answers to the question, what is this person able to do and to be? And if you go back to that quote that I showed you at the beginning, which is the purpose of development is to ensure that we all have the ability, an enabling environment within which we can live rich and healthy and creative lives. So what's interesting to me about the idea of capabilities is what Nussbaum says here. They're not just the abilities residing inside a person, but also the freedoms or opportunities created by a combination of personal abilities and the political, social, and economic environment. So the best illustration of this that I have thought of is the situation of women. Martha Nussbaum herself is an example of this. She, as a significant philosopher, and could not have achieved what she's achieved 100 years ago, because women were not able to gain degrees from most universities 100 years ago. So she'd been born in the 19th century. At best, she might have been able to be a writer. She'd been born in the 18th century. She'd have had no chance even of that. The political, social, and economic environment has changed to enable women to not only go to school, but go to university, to gain degrees, to have careers, and the whole of humanity has benefited enormously from literally doubling the number of potential people who are able to contribute to our knowledge and our understanding. So I wanted to think about how does that relate to this idea of people being able to participate in the cultural life of the community, and particularly in relation to those intentions that I had talked about before. And in the Rome Charter, I proposed 5 cultural capabilities, which could be the purpose of cultural policy. So my thinking here is that the Scottish Government, for example, or Creative Scotland, or organisations like the Stove, or Scottish Opera, or whoever it might be, could see their mission not as cultural democratisation, or even social change, or cultural democracy, but to ensure that people have the cultural capabilities that allow them to participate fully in the cultural life of the community. And these 5 capabilities were deliberately written in the simplest way possible for 2 reasons. One, because unless the ideas that we are using are understandable to the people that we are wanting to work with, then cultural democracy is not possible. We are already up people we want to work with. So in my head, working with the City of Rome, I was kept saying to me and to them, this has to be understandable to a taxi driver or a hairdresser or a teacher in Rome. If you're going to publish a charter that says this is what we're doing, it has to be comprehensible. So we said, we think that people should be able to discover culture, create culture. Oop, I don't know what's happened there, sorry. Share culture, enjoy culture, and protect it. And that if you can do those 5 things, then in effect, you are able to participate in the cultural life of the community. And that the charter was adopted not only by the City of Rome, but by a global organization called United Cities and Local Governments, UCLG, which is based in Barcelona. And one of the things that made this a really rewarding thing to be working on during the first lockdown was having conversations over Zoom with people from literally all over the world, from all the continents except Antarctica, and hearing them starting to use these ideas and use them to frame their thinking. So this is as far as my thinking has got on these things. And this is why I said I would come back to this image at the end in this quote. The purpose of development, and here I could say the purpose of cultural development, is to create an enabling environment for people to enjoy long, healthy and creative lives. And it's by having access to these cultural capabilities, I think, that we can help ourselves and our neighbours to fulfill their right under Article 27 and their potential to participate in the cultural life of the community.